So why am I making this video? In short, a few other people have covered this iceberg, but to my knowledge, no one has covered the whole of it, and a lot of the people who make videos like this simply like to point out how disturbing some of this stuff is and just Google it and don't have a lot of respect for it or actually play it. I was inspired particularly here by Nyx Fears, aka May Leets, who did a YouTube video where she takes a look at the same disturbing movie Iceberg as Wendigoon, but she's seen a lot more of those movies and understands where they're coming from more due to her experiences. So I wanted to make my own video from a place of appreciation about these games. This video is in no particular order, but it should have a downwards pattern on the iceberg, and I am roughly trying to follow it. This video will cover the first 40 something games on this iceberg that I've already played. A few disclaimers before we get started. Number one, if a franchise here is mentioned, I will only be playing the original in that series and talking about it. I will, however, because that's what it says on the iceberg, I will, however, be talking about sequels if I've already played them. Number two, if there is a game on this list which is NSFW and I talk about it, I will be attempting to talk about the game on its own merits and not just express disgust at the content. If you're not comfortable with me talking about the games like this, you should click off this video now. I believe these games should be treated like art, but that doesn't mean I believe all of these games have artistic merit. Number three. Some of these games have behind-the-scenes stuff that I don't particularly want to talk about. Scott Cawthon and Neil Druckmann's political views, for instance. If the creator did something objectionable or even criminal, like a certain Doki Doki Literature Club mods dev and a FNAF fan games mod, which I'll be mentioning later on, consider that an acknowledgement of that here. I believe these subjects are worth talking about, but they're outside of the scope of this video. Number four. I'm a pretty upbeat person when it comes to the stuff I like. I like everything, or I try and like everything. So I'll be talking positively and recommending a lot of these games, rather than just talking about what's disturbing about them. But I will be talking about what's disturbing about them in addition. But mostly, I'm just trying to make recommendations. Number five, I'm quite bad at video games, so I won't be talking about difficulty as a positive or negative factor. I'm disregarding that fact unless difficulty is an official selling point. And number six, a few of these games, especially the internet horror games, have a lot of hidden lore and theories behind them, but I will try and avoid talking about that as it isn't something I'm always be well informed on. It's not always really relevant to recommendations unless you're specifically going into a game looking for that, which is, I don't know if that's common. Five Nights at Freddy's. I've only played the first FNAF game to completion, although I never beat 420 mode. Yeah, I know, fake fan. But I think this game should be appreciated on its own merits. It has some really great atmosphere and uses the limitations of technology very well, like how it doesn't really visually depict any movement or human characters, which makes the game look pretty good for how limited a budget it was made on. And it sounds really good, even though it's just sound music. Gameplay loop is pretty unique too. This game is often described as a jump scare game, but it's really not, as the jump scares are only really there if you fail, as opposed to something like Layers of Fear where the jump scares are scripted. This game specifically is mostly about atmosphere, which is ironically what a lot of the real horror fans who turn their nose up at this type of game tend to praise in other games like Silent Hill 2. I can't really talk about the sequels as I haven't played them, but this original is a cultural touchstone and well worth your time. I've also read the first two novels. I'm more of a book girl than I am a gamer girl, so maybe I'll talk about them one day. I played The Last of Us Remastered on PS4 when I was a teenager, and I think it's pretty good. It is derivative of a lot of other works, yes, but it has its own little originality with the way it portrays zombies, which I know isn't strictly unique. You can see it in other games like Darkest Dungeon, but does do a lot to differentiate it, visually. The best way I can sum it up is that it's not original, but it iterates on its formula well and was accessible enough to bring games as an art form into the mainstream. I know it didn't do that solely on itself. There's other games like Gone Home, but this is a very mainstream example of that. I did play the sequel relatively recently, and I am tempted to make an entire video about that game, because I have a lot of mixed and polarizing feelings about just about every aspect of that game, from its gameplay to its story to the ultimate fan backlash. Moving on. Doom is pretty fun. I've played the original and the 2016 remake to completion, and played bits of Eternal 2, 3, and 64, but never really finished any of them. The original game will require like a source port to play easily nowadays. I use GZ Doom personally, but there's lots of others like Chocolate Doom, which is like much more authentic to the original. There are better FPS games out there, but there's better horror movies than The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and there's better science fiction novels than Frankenstein, and better heist movies than The Great Train Robbery. But playing it is more about seeing where our games today came from, because it's the root of so many things. The follow up to the series Quake is where we get WSD from, for instance. Like, id Software was really influential on PC gaming. Aesthetically and gameplay wise, it's much more interesting than its predecessor Wolfenstein 3D and many other FPS games to this day. It mixes a lot of sci-fi, horror and fantasy, and it all comes together surprisingly cohesively in my opinion. There's a big variety of power up and each weapon feels unique and distinct, so I would say it holds up pretty well if you use a source port, and you should absolutely play it if you have any interest in FPS history at all. I like Outlast. It's got solid atmosphere, interesting character design. It translates the found footage genre of horror movies to video games well by making your camera an essential gameplay ingredient. FNAF also did this, although that was more paranormal activity, where this is more like the Blair Witch Project, especially in the sequel, which I have played some of. Outlast does suffer from showing too much of its monsters, which is often a problem in games, as they all need full 3D models thanks to a lot of the time. But I think the green of the night vision camera really seeks to obscure their looks in an effective way, where you can't always really tell what you're looking at. Some people criticize games like Outlast for their stigmatization of mental health issues and mental health care, but I like that Outlast portrays the characters' behaviors as more as a product of the experiments that have been performed on them, as opposed to it being their mental illness. The ending and the first part of Whistleblower, which I have played, show the cruelty of the system well. It's by no means a perfect portrayal, but I definitely think it could be worse. If you like Little Nightmares, you should play Inside and Limbo. They're all cut from the same cloth, with a similar small child protagonist in a scary world that's much bigger than them, using the same 2 or 2.5D platforming, puzzle solving, and light stealth elements. I like Little Nightmares more than Limbo, if only because the protagonist's yellow raincoat makes her stand out more from the background. It's aesthetically quite hard to describe, reminding me a lot of the 1991 film Delicatessen, if you've seen it. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it also has very similar themes of consumption, food, and cannibalism. But this one is unique in that it's set in a submarine where children are the size of rats and adults are these grotesque mutated giants. Another movie it kind of reminded me of is The Box Trolls, if you've seen that. It's only a few hours long, so it's definitely worth your time if you're into this sort of thing. And there is a sequel, which I have played, plus DLC and a third game, which I haven't played. The second game is more of the same, more or less, with a slightly less interesting setting and aesthetic, but new monsters who, fulfill the need. Hatred is the edgiest game ever made, but that isn't really a criticism to me, because that's what it's trying to do. It was made with the express intention of being very, very edgy and very anti-woke, and as a response to the increasingly amount of colourful games being released. Whilst I may disagree with the reasons for its creation, it's still someone's cohesive aesthetic vision, and I enjoyed it in that sense. It uses metal music in the soundtrack, and the voice actor for our protagonist, whose name is not important. So fundamentally, I can say it was trying to capture in game form the aesthetic of that kind of music. I don't really know enough about black metal. What I forgot to mention is that the voice actor for Not Important is a black metal vocalist, and that's why I don't know enough about black metal itself to say whether it was capturing that aesthetic cohesively. And although I do know enough about black metal to know that Cry of Fear is inspired by DSBM, depressive suicidal black metal, but I'll talk about that later. Although the music it mostly personally reminded me of would be like Gore Grind or Slam, as opposed to Dragon Force or Metallica, if you catch my drift. It's also inspired by Postal, the original game, not the sequels, being directly referenced in dialogue, "Only my weapon understands me," and having the same isometric viewpoint. but it runs a lot better on modern hardware and has less of that, 90s jank. So if you're interested in that type of game or that kind of music and you haven't played it already, I would say it's worth checking out. Moving on to something a bit more lighthearted, Bioshock is a very good game and one I'd recommend to anyone with an interest in games as an art form or the history of FPS games like with Doom. I do think the original game is a tiny bit overrated, but the second game is my favourite game of all time and probably the reason in a cosmic sense why I'm making this video today. There's also Bioshock Infinite, which I think is quite overrated and it has a kind of shit story, but it's ultimately okay. It's playable, enjoyable, The original game and later Infinite tried to be more intellectual in their stories, like the game equivalent of literary fiction, whereas 2 has a more emotional story, which I think works in its favour. But the original is very much part of history, and its commentary on the nature of free will and how it applies to video games was brought that kind of commentary into the mainstream. And the gameplay is, if you want to think about gameplay, then that's kind of like System Shock 2 mixed with Half-Life 2, as in there's physics objects and a gravity gun equivalent with open maps, light stealth and RPG elements. Combining all of that modern FPS stuff with System Shock 2, the more modern FPS stuff with the sort of RPG elements of System Shock 2, although much, much lighter. The settings and enemies are probably even more iconic than that, being this sort of crumbling underwater Art Deco city that's populated with mutant drug addicts called splicers and hulking diving suit monsters called Big Daddies. Basically, it's an interesting piece of first-person history like Doom that's a lot easier to run on modern hardware, having been re-released for the 8th generation of consoles. I played Bendy and the Machine when it was newer, although I'm not really sure what to compare it to gameplay-wise, as it has a few basic weapons, mostly melee, but it isn't really action-focused at all, so I would say it's somewhere between Outlast and Cry of Fear or Silent Hill or something like that. This game is most notable for its aesthetic influences from both Bioshock, with the pipes and inks replacing water, but being much more uniquely stylized, influenced by 1920s and 30s black and white animation like Max Fleischer and Disney, but in the very early days like Steamboat Willie. I talk a lot about capturing an aesthetic with a game, and this game does that. Definitely does well in translating that aesthetic into a 3D space. Cuphead does a similar thing, but I think that's more like iterating on that style as opposed to creating its own thing like Bendy and the Machine does. The gameplay is a bit lacking, but from what I've seen of the sequel, there's a big improvement on that front over there. I don't really remember if I found this game scary or not, but it's definitely interesting, and it's worth playing if you're interested in that style of animation, or if you're interested in the history of indie horror games that are popular to talk about on YouTube, like FNAF and Little Nightmares.
Danganronpa. I've played all of these games to completion except the spin-off game and the gacha game, and I've had a lot of fun with them. My entry point to the series was actually the anime adaptation of the first game, after which I played Danganronpa 2, which is getting a remake later this year. It's very stereotypically anime, and it's a series of murder mystery death game visual novels, with the gameplay mostly consisting of rapid fire minigames during the game's murder trials called class trials, and it also has some light exploration elements where you can move around and talk to different characters during certain scenes. The music of these games is actually often very often used in YouTube videos, and it's really good, very jazzy with a lot of interesting samples. And there have been some controversies about the series content, but I recommend it to anyone who likes anime, anybody who likes murder mystery or death games, or as anyone who's interested in getting into visual novels. I actually think it makes a pretty good entry point into the visual novels because the plot moves quite fast and the exploration and gameplay can help break up the reading sections. I also recommend Doki Doki Literature Club to people trying to get into visual novels, but we will cross that bridge when we come to it.
What?
Doki Doki Literature Club. Well, here it is. This is an interesting one, being a satirical dating simulator game that goes into a creepypasta-esque horror twist around the midpoint. There's a tech rules video that breaks down how all of the tricks works, link in the description. It's really interesting to see how all of those Easter eggs work in a game engine as simple as Ren'Py. It's a game in disguise, but pretty much no one is going to fall for it anymore, which may lessen the appeal. Although in my opinion, the target audience of the disguise is so different from the target audience of the actual game that it would likely not be nearly as successful if the secret wasn't already out. Although among people who relate to the mental illness themes of the game, the cute horror contrast is very appealing. The game has faced some criticism for its surface level satire on visual novels, but it's also been the entry point to the medium for a lot of people, myself included. There's also lore. I don't know everything about it, but apparently there was supposed to be some form of sequel under the name Project Libertina, which hasn't come out yet.
This is the Dead by Daylight is the only multiplayer game I actually consistently play. I have a couple hundred hours in it trying to get all of the achievements. So basically this game lets you play as either the monster or a victim in a slasher movie inspired setup, which features a lot of other characters from different properties. Part of its importance nowadays is as a museum of horror containing basically playable versions of characters and locations from quite a few other games on this iceberg, such as Resident Evil, Five Nights at Freddy's and Silent Hill. However, they did lose the license to several classics recently like Hellraiser and Halloween, so if you're wondering why Pinhead and Michael Myers aren't in the game, that'll be why. This game has had its ups and downs with a very complicated history of balancing issues, glitches and controversies that are outside of the scope of this video, but if there's a horror or horror adjacent character you really like, check this game out because they might just be playable in it. Left 4 Dead is a 4-player co-op zombie shooter made by Valve. It's pretty fun, but most co-op FPS games, it's much more about being fun than it is about being scary or disturbing or telling an interesting story. That said, it does have some pretty interesting ideas like the environmental storytelling graffiti in the safe rooms, the really good atmosphere in sections like the Tunnel of Love in the sequel, or the cornfields in the Blood Harvest campaign. And a lot of people find the witch enemy genuinely scary. It briefly turns the game into like a real horror game. I have played the sequel, which has all of the same content ported over plus more, so I recommend that more than I recommend the original. And you should only really play the original if you're interested in the history or you're making a YouTube video about it like me. Limbo is pretty much the progenitor of games like Inside and Little Nightmares. Limbo is about a small child in a big scary world navigating obstacles and dying violently. This game's aesthetic is purely monochromatic and very minimalistic, which creates a pretty good atmosphere, but there isn't really much going on narratively. It's all visual and thematic. You can sort of extrapolate a story from the abandoned environments, the monsters, the characters, and the title of the game, but that's all left up to you as the player. A big difference between this game and like Inside and Little Nightmares is that it's fully 2D instead of 2.5D. It's not that big a distinction, but I thought I would throw it out there. Spec Ops The Line is a subversive take on the military shooter genre that was massive back in the 2000s and early 2010s. It hasn't ever really gone away, but it isn't nearly as big as it was back before. So Spec Ops The Line is much darker and grittier than your average military shooter, even darker than games like Call of Duty World at War, and it takes heavy cues from Apocalypse Now, even being inspired by the same novella, Heart of Darkness, albeit porting it from the Vietnam War to a Middle Eastern setting that feels more familiar to modern conflicts. I think it iterates on the military shooter's roots well, or at least aesthetically, being set in a version of Dubai that's been devastated by a massive sandstorm, and that plays into gameplay a lot, with explosions kicking up sand that can stun enemies, there being these big sandstorm set pieces, and there being a lot of sand-based environmental kills. There is a pretty infamous scene in this game I won't spoil, but it started a controversy as to if a game can blame the player for actions the game forced them to do in order to progress. Personally, I agree with Walt Williams, the narrative designer of this game, who also worked on Bioshock 2, that in which you always have a choice in a game because you can literally just turn it off and stop playing, which is symbolically reflected in stuff like the game having a stop sign right at the start. Muv-Luv. The first Muv-Luv game is not disturbing unless you are disturbed by incredibly tedious wish fulfillment slice of life anime bullshit, which I am.
This is the first game I'm talking about here, which I actively dislike because it's required reading for the sequels, which are military science fiction, and the sequels, especially that last game, Love Alternative, are generally considered deserving. However, obeying my own rules, I have only played the first game and was so sick of it by the end that even the change of pace by starting the sequel couldn't get me through it, and I gave up. Despite being marked not safe for work, the first game features very few actual love scenes, the main two routes only having a single one at the end. They are very, very tame unless you want to count the fact that they seem to be made from the point of the view of someone who doesn't actually believe women can enjoy sex and thinks of it as suffering they endure for the amusement of men. If you want a more comprehensive view on those last two games, which takes place in an apocalyptic alien invasion, I recommend looking elsewhere. Duck Season. Another disclosure is that I don't own a VR headset and as such haven't played this game as intended, only in flat mode. It's basically a modern version of Duck Hunt and a playable gaming creepypasta where you play as a kid who receives a haunted version of the game Duck Season, and the character from the game comes to life and starts killing people if you aggravate him. The studio behind this game, Stress Level Zero, went on to create Boneworks and are currently working on a game called B-Side. I think it's a cool throwback. I think Duck Season is a cool throwback to 1980s aesthetics and 2000s internet cultures with the creepypasta, but there's really not much to talk about unless you want to get into the lore. What Remains of Edith Finch. This is a walking simulator game with some very interesting presentation, as the main gameplay is living out the last moments of the lives of various members of the Finch family whilst exploring their house. The Finch family are all doomed to die prematurely except one. So you explore the house looking for mementos of each death, and then you get to play it out. The highlights for me include a scene where you play as a baby who drowned, read the psychiatric report of a man who decapitated himself in a fish factory, and read this and another one where you read the horror comic adaptation of one of the family members' murders. Each segment is very unique, and it injects a lot of variety into the walking simulator genre, and I really recommend it if you are interested in games being viewed as a form of art. Cry of Fear. You've heard of boomer shooters, you've heard of gooner shooters, now get ready for the first doomer shooter. I kid, I really like this game. I rarely find horror games scary, but this one is incredibly good at it. The music is incredible too, even though it's not the depressive, suicidal black metal that the game is inspired by. It's inspired gameplay-wise by Silent Hill, but it's in first person and has a much more urban setting that works to its grey, depressing aesthetic, really nicely. If I remember correctly, a lot of the faces and textures in the game are scanned from real things, which gives it this great uncanny valley vibe. There's also this section in the game, in the vents of a subway station, that has scared me more than any game I have ever played. There's a ton to praise about this game, and it's free, so you have literally no reason not to play it. Go play it. You can pause this video, I promise you won't regret it. That Dragon Cancer. Everyone done playing Cry of Fear? Great. Now we can talk about this game. I find this game really interesting because it's the intersection of an extremely thoughtful and personal piece of art that directly adapts the death of the creator's real child into video game form, albeit in a heavily stylized way, and that intersects with massive technical incompetence. This game broke a few times whilst I was playing it, which took me out of what is otherwise a very emotional experience. The titular segment where our story told to children uses the metaphor that their brother is a knight fighting a dragon called Cancer is particularly broken, requiring me to restart it numerous times. I think I had to go through it at least 10 times in order to finish it. This game has also faced some criticism for its religious content, being about both the creator's personal struggles dealing with his son's illness and his resulting crisis of faith. Personally, I think this is a bit of a moot point, as fundamentally it's about one man's mental struggle in the face of his child's death, which can include a crisis of faith, because that's an obvious outcome of it. Whilst I respect that people can't relate to that aspect of the game where they could relate to other aspects of the game, I don't think it really makes the game any less authentic or any less good at what it's trying to do. It's largely the technical problems that do that. Layers of Fear. A bit sillier. This game is about a portrait artist navigating a surrealistic house, searching for resources to finish one last painting. It has sort of an experimental narrative structure like Detention, which we'll talk about later, where it can be hard to tell exactly what point the game starts and what it's flashing back to. I consider this game pretty decent. I wouldn't call it awful, but it's not particularly scary, and some parts are hard to figure out what you're actually supposed to do. Bloober Team did go on to make the Silent Hill 2 remake, which a lot of people seem to really like, and Observer, which other people seem to like, so there's some clear talent that went into this game, but on its own it's just not very good. Worth your time? Maybe. Worth your money? Not unless it's 50+% off on Steam, although it is summer sale right now, so maybe. And DLC campaign is pretty good actually, but I am pretty biased in favor of female protagonists.
There is still a way.
Little Misfortune. This game comes from the same developers as Frambo, which I have started but I haven't finished. I don't think this game is particularly disturbing, although seeing the depravity of the adult world through the eyes of a child will definitely be for some, and does feature some disturbing stuff, which is largely spoilers, so I won't get into it. It's sort of cutesy as opposed to Frambo, which went for a more outwardly creepy aesthetic, and follows a girl who the game's mysterious narrator quickly tells us it will die on that day. She then follows the voice's instructions to solve 2D point-and-click puzzles. Most of the elements which are disturbing are either spoilers or kind of hard to talk about, as they are background elements that rely pretty heavily on implication. This game is quite short, so if you're thinking about playing Frambo and don't know yet, I recommend picking up this game and playing it to see if you'll like it.
What I said earlier.
Don't take this risk. This is probably the first game that is this short that I'm talking about, being less than an hour. There are quite a few endings, although I didn't get all of them, nor do I think you need to do all of them to get that experience. The best part of the game for me by far is the start, where you're tasked with responding to a man who accidentally calls you instead of the suicide hotline. It's the tensest thing in any visual novel I've played. It's great. You have to give like timed responses to his answers or he'll hang up and off himself, and you have to listen to him off himself, and it's really kind of unpleasant. And like I feel like that's just great. I do think the second half is kind of weak though, where it sort of just turns into a bad boy romance, which isn't really playing to the game's strength at all. I recommend it, but just for that first part, not the second.
Please leave your message.
Calm Time, also a very short game, and like Don't Take This Risk, it's free. This game has a lot of interesting elements, the intro and endings being the most interesting parts, although a lot is left up to interpretation. There is some technical issues, like the characters you're meant to stab. Oh yeah, the whole point of the game is that you're stabbing a house full of guests to death, who often move too fast, require you to chase them down a few times to finish them off. There's no fail state in this game, so it evens out. But it's free, so on that grounds it's kind of hard to criticize for me. Check this game out. If a game about someone killing a house full of people in order to preserve the quietness of his life sounds good to you. The Static Speaks My Name. Yet another tiny free game. The Static Speaks My Name is about a shut-in going about their strange daily routine of eating shrimp out of their fish tank and considering having very intimate conversations with thirst-trapped scam bots on the internet before the game reveals that you have a naked man in a cage who you can decide whether or not to kill. As the game's description states, the protagonist is obsessed with finding the meaning behind a painting, although in-game this is relegated to one room in the house and we never find out, and the implication is they never find out what it is.
Follow me, bodies this way.
Condemned. I've played the first game but never managed to finish the second, which is locked on PS3 and Xbox 360. It has a segment which I really struggle with on controllers. This PS3 era game this first game is about Ethan Thomas, an FBI agent tracking down various serial killers in a city where something is making the birds kill themselves and turning the homeless population into murderers. It's got elements of a detective game with investigations with multiple choice questions, but most of the gameplay is focused around melee combat, as you lose your gun really quickly into the game and have to improvise a solution. It's really impressive how many melee weapons there are in the game, from like standard stuff like pipes and planks to being able to like rip the blade off of a guillotine paper cutter or like pull the desks out of drawers to use them. It's great.
Like I said, I've managed to never beat the second game, but the first game is really good. It's on PC, but it takes itself a lot more seriously than the sequel. Inside, I played this game a long time ago, but I remember liking it. I compared it a lot to Limbo and Little Nightmares, but this one has much more interesting puzzles and a story that actually feels implied rather than just conspicuously absent. You play as this kid trying to run away from a company that performs human experiments, who seem very, very determined to kill you for some reason. The ending is iconic, and it's disturbing moments. The ending in the section, it has a lot of disturbing moments, especially the ending and the section with the mermaids. That got to me personally. Of the 3 games on this iceberg that I've talked about that are like this one, this is probably the best and the most worth your time. Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion. This game is pretty interesting in that there are quite a few games on this list that disguise themselves as something like Doki Doki Literature Club, but this game sort of disguises itself as a parody horror game before it then brings out the real scares. In that respect, it has a pretty unique tone in my opinion. When the monsters do come out, they're interesting. Some are pretty scary, and although the game does get repetitive after a while, the original is free, so I recommend checking it out. It's also pretty light on jump scares outside of a few cheesy cardboard cutouts, so that part of the title bothers you, consider this your permission to play it. The creator of this game, Akuma Kira, also created Lost in Vivo, a much more serious horror game we'll talk about later on. Bible Black. This is the first real NSFW game or era game on this list, and I have played it, seen the prequel anime, and played some of the sequel game called Bible Black The Infection. A Renpai port of this game does exist, similar to GZ Doom, although it's AI upscaled, and I think as of now the creator's account, who they code by Erogay developer on itch.io by the way, may have been suspended, but you should try and check it out. That's the easiest way to play it on modern hardware, but it's not, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Bible Black is about a teenage boy who discovers the titular Bible Black, a magic book that contains many spells, especially those relevant to sex. He becomes involved in a cult conspiracy involving the school's black magic club, which the book is at the center of. It exists to facilitate the not safe for work content, and some of those age scenes, as well as especially the more violent ones, can be disturbing, but I don't think the story is that bad. Some of the endings feel out of left field, whereas others feel like appropriate resolutions. That's kind of just a problem with the format. Most of them are bad endings, but there is a true good ending where the evil is defeated and you kind of, happily ever after. Although the anime adaptation does change that, so it's like the evil is still there, sort of like a Friday the 13th movie. This is the first Sei Shoujo game on this list, who we'll be seeing again. She's a very interesting artist whose work has actually played a pretty big role in my life. Euphoria. This is another not safe for work game. It's a lot more disturbing than Bible Black, being heavy on rape, BDSM and scat, and also has some pretty violent death scenes. The plot revolves around, again, a teenage boy with extremely violent sexual fantasies who he's forced to act out on his classmates in a sort of like death game scenario. I did actually play this game when I was 16, I'm 21 now, and it caused me 3 panic attacks during the noose scene, an electric chair scene, and one such scene involving vomit and scat. If you know, you know. It was likely responsible for my interest in a lot of these games, as Euphoria is interesting as hentai plots go, exploring how far you can push a person, the line between sexual fantasy and real action, redemption, and what it's like to go through life with these desires in your heart. Because it affected my life so much, I consider it one of the most important visual novels to me personally. I couldn't really recommend it to anyone, but it's a prime example of what I mean when I say games with intense sexual content can be art. The plot simply wouldn't work without it. Saya no Uta. That translates to Song of Saya, by the way. Moving on to a not safe for work game where I believe the content works to its detriment, we have Saya no Uta. Saya no Uta has a really interesting premise. The main character has a brain injury that causes him to hallucinate the whole world is made as meat and gore, and the only normal human to him is a young girl called Saya. The problem is Saya is drawn like a child and the two have sex a lot. Personally, I think the plot would
work just fine without that content, hence why this game is marked purple. Versions of it without that content are available. But the underlying story and the aesthetics and the music of the game are really well done. It's pretty short too. I played it when I was 19 during a drinking game, or like in one sitting. It's a couple hours long. It's not super short, but you get the point. Most of the game's really disturbing stuff comes from those not safe for work themes, although the visuals can be otherwise pretty intense, and there are scenes of cannibalism, murder, suicide, you know. I recommend checking it out, but I don't think you'll miss much if you play it on a safe for work version. It Moves, finally something that isn't error gay. It Moves is another very short indie game and the first RPG Maker game we'll be talking about. This is a playable creepypasta, although not in the same sense as Duck Season or Sonic Doki.exe. It's just a creepypasta that uses the medium of a game to tell its story. It follows a young boy who's tormented by nightmares and seemingly has something else living in his room with him. It's pretty good for what it is. It's free, it's on Steam, and the dreams show off some creativity. Just there's not really that much to say about it. Slide in the Woods! Yet another super short indie game that's also free. I really like this one, and it's probably my favourite in that category of these super short, experimental, free indie games that I've talked about so far. It's very tense and very surreal, relying a lot on implication in a really good way. And it is absolutely scary. I did find it scary. There are sections of this game that reminds me of the very scary ending of the Borderlands, which is also known as The Final Prayer, which is a found footage movie, and it makes use of its unconventional controls very well to increase the tension. Highly recommended. Red Candle Games. There are multiple Red Candle games as a studio, including Devotion, which was pulled from Steam, but in short, Red Candle makes specifically Taiwanese horror games, which play on Taiwanese culture and history. Detention is about a period of Taiwanese history when the country was under martial law, and the fate that befalls a book club that reads bad literature. It's a side-scrolling 2D point-and-click puzzle game thing with some stealth elements with a black and white aesthetic that tries to evoke photographs from that era. It has some really interesting horror ideas in the more supernatural sense, but it's been a long time since I've played the game, so I can't name specifics. I really like this game, this type of game, which is like a horror that's unique to a culture that isn't Western culture. And it's a good way, in my opinion, to get people interested in stuff outside of their own culture and outside of their own like horror niche, and and also to educate people about history who may have just been completely unaware of it. Dead by Daylight does actually attempt this with the Oni and the Krasu from Japan and Thailand respectively, but it's just not the same as it being made by people from that country. Discover My Body. Another short free indie game. Take a shot every time you hear that one. This is a science fiction game and based on the idea of humans putting fungal growths into their body in order to become part of one consciousness. There's like a technical term for that, but I can't be bothered to look it up. You get to examine the process as it progresses using like an X-ray. And it's definitely a unique concept, and the name of the gameplay sort of make me think it's playing specifically on some old entertainment game, but I wouldn't know what that is. Pretty good. Oh yeah, Lost in Vivo! This is a self-described horror game about claustrophobia that has you exploring various underground environments in search of your lost dog. I don't have claustrophobia, except for like caves, but I'll get into that in a later video probably, but a lot of those tunnel crawling sequences made me feel like it would feel to have that. The game is genuinely scary. The puzzles and the symbolism around them are very interesting. They reminded me a lot of Cry of Fear, as it also takes place from a first person perspective. Also like Cry of Fear, it's by far at its scariest when the lights go out and the walls close in. Shocker, I know, but it really works. There are themes of mental health and human experimentation in this game, which were introduced with Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion, as well as some lore surrounding one of the monsters from Spooky's, but it's taken much more seriously here. Highly recommended. Just got so much. It's also got a ton of interesting side content. Like, there's so much to love about this game. Now, something I'm less hot on, JFK Reloaded.
Not a lot to talk about this game. With this game, it's this bare bones simulation that lets you shoot JFK or fuck around and shoot other people to cause some wacky physics stuff to happen. It's like a Gmod level, and you can see everything it has to offer in 5 minutes. You've probably heard the story that this game was made to prove the official JFK narrative, or achieving 100% accuracy is impossible, and that the one person who got the highest score won a bunch of money, yada yada. I don't think this game is that interesting, but it is free, so check it out if you like. Starless, Nymphomaniac's Paradise. This is another eroge, specifically a nukage, meaning it has a very high amount of sexual content, like it's pretty much constant. I have a very weird experience with this game. I also played this when I was 16, shortly after playing Euphoria. At that age of my life, I was searching for the most disturbing games of all time, sort of like I am doing now. And this game was often at the top of lists or mentioned in passing. And this game fucked me up. The content was way too much for me to handle, and I was pretty much having flashbacks to it at one point. I consider this experience valuable as it was like formative, but this is not a game I can recommend to anyone. Maybe not even if you're like into the fetishes depicted in this game, because it just goes the extra mile. In short, Starless is about a college student who gets hired to work at a mansion where all manner of sexual depravity takes place. Pretty much any fetish you can imagine gets explored, except like the, Saya no Uta stuff, because Sei Sojo, thankfully, really likes big tits, so that never comes into play. It also has this like psychological aspect to it, with the main character being psychologically tormented, like being chained up in a basement with nothing to do by himself for months, or being sent a video of the girl he likes being gangbanged after successfully managing to escape from his job. Most of the plot is about human trafficking, which is just plainly fucked by itself, but in its purest form, it's about suffering. If you like the 120 Days of Sodom or Salo, you probably will like this, as it has similar ideas and is actually directly referenced in some of the sequels. How Fish is Made. This is a student project made by Wrong Organ, the creators of Mouthwashing, and the DLC implies that they take place in the same universe. You play as a fish in a fish factory who can make choices to navigate it, which ultimately end up in the same place. It's a hard game to talk about as it's very surreal and artsy. My personal theory is that it takes place in the mind of one of the characters in Mouthwashing, possibly Curly, and represents a realization that he couldn't have made any choice that could have possibly saved him from where he is now, but I may be completely wrong in that. Another interpretation is that it actually takes place from the perspective of Anya in her mind, and has a similar idea about choice because she has a book which references The Fish is Made on her shelf in the game Mouthwashing, but that's just my bullshit theory. Horror. World of Horror. Now this one is a fun one. I actually follow the development of this game pretty closely. It's a roguelike inspired by the works of Junji Ito and H.P. Lovecraft, with a 1-bit aesthetic that's pretty unique to it in terms of modern games. It's probably the only 1-bit game on this Iceberg. It follows one of 14 selectable protagonists who investigates various weird mysteries in the town of Shiakawa, which is doomed to be destroyed by an eldritch god. This feeling is represented by the Doom meter, which ticks up with every action, so you always know exactly how close you are to the end of the world. It incorporates staples of the horror game medium, such as a sanity meter, although it functions more like an alternative health bar in this game, and doesn't have any special effects when it gets low. Behind the scenes, this game is known for having extremely long hiatuses between updates, during which the solo development is usually silent. These do eventually come out, but scores of people will declare the game dead. Each time, I think one person is even trying to sue them this time for it. On the Steam forums, because those are crazy. One of these hiatuses is currently ongoing, apparently due to a problem with the publisher. The new update is known to include a tarot-themed character, which I'm pretty excited for. Milk inside of a bag of milk inside a bag of milk. This is a 15-minute indie game, similar to the ones I've already talked about a lot, but this one you actually have to pay for. You are tasked with helping a very mentally ill girl, you play as like a voice in a head, go to the store to buy milk. It includes direct depictions of paranoid delusions and compulsive behaviour, and is popular among people who relate to the protagonist. You may have seen art from the second game being used as like profile pictures. There are two endings depending on how well you help her. The game's art style was quite unique, consisting of only very vague shapes that like vaguely allude to what's going on. I like that a lot personally because it reminds me of my experiences with like psychedelics, where I could technically see what was happening, but it was just like a blur. This game has a sequel called Milk Outside of a Bag of Milk Outside of a Bag of Milk, commonly called Milk 2. I haven't played it, but it picks up immediately where the previous game left off and has a much more conventional art style, hence why it's used for profile pictures. It's also way longer, being several hours with multiple endings. Suits, a corporate RPG. I wouldn't really call this game disturbing, although it does have some disturbing subject matter like cannibalism in, but it's mostly absurdist with a lot of references and comedy. My favourite parts of the game being where you kill pastiches of real life YouTubers and also Sheldon Cooper, who's a turtle. It's very unique with its ideas, as the name suggests. It's a corporate RPG where instead of fighting dragons with swords in a dungeon, you walk around a monochromatic office buildings and fight file clerks with staplers. I haven't played Earthbound, but I imagine that must have been an inspiration for this. It translates corporate culture into the gameplay, having a pay-to-win option in every combat encounter that just costs more each time, like an EA game taken to the extreme as a joke. It's a few hours long, and I recommend you giving it a shot. It's not the best, but it's very interesting. 2:22 AM. This one is interesting, but very hard to talk about. It's a free, short indie game, I know, not yada yada, playing on the idea of weird late-night television. Each scene will have you doing something like digging a grave, moving through a city, or digging a grave before it randomly cuts to another one, eventually abruptly ending. You just there's also stuff like a cooking show where you cut vegetables on a tray. It's if you deleted half the files from WarioWare. I described the gameplay like those TF2 videos where people like delete the files from the game to see like just how broken it becomes. It's like if you did that with WarioWare and removed like the timer. Pretty unique aesthetically. I actually found this game found out about this game from Jacob Geller, so I'm recommending it. Morimiyo Middle School Shooting. This game was made by an Eroguro artist who typically goes by Eric online. It's Eric followed by a bunch of numbers. It follows a morbidly depressed middle school girl whose mother commits suicide and her father abandons her, who decides to shoot up her school. The game contains unlockable weapons which reference real-life mass shootings. The goal of the game is to shoot and kill as many of people as possible to score points, avoiding being subdued by teachers in the process. It's that simple. It was made in RPG Maker, but is a top-down shooter with simulated recoil, which makes the game feel pretty awkward to play, although I understand the dev likely couldn't make the game with more complex tools. The currently available translation of this game is an older version of the game, which is free. There is an updated version with more content, but I believe that's currently only available in Japanese, although if you want to download that, that's also going to be free. The Sin, or Greh, is a Russian visual novel made in Renpai, which was also used to make Doki Doki Literature Club. The game is a uniquely Russian horror story about the conflict between city-dwelling New Russians and the more religious folk who live in the countryside. The plot involves a dying witch who is trying to find someone to pass her power on to before she dies, so the whole town refuses to touch her. It's not really disturbing any more than your average horror novel like a Stephen King, but it's pretty obscure, so that's why it's so low down on this iceberg. Unfortunately, the game's translation is quite bad. According to a Russian-speaking friend of mine, it fails a major aspect of it. The translation fails a major aspect of the game's writing, which is the distinction between countryside and city dialects in Russian, and as such I have a hard time recommending it to people who can only read English. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. Apologies for any poor quality. I'm using my laptop's built-in microphone to record, and I have to work around my family, so in order to get this video done, I had to do most of it in one take. Once I get a job and have a place of my own, the videos will likely improve in quality, but until then, it's going to be pretty rough. I'm currently also suffering due to a heat wave and my allergies, so thanks for hearing me out. See you next time. Oh yeah, so the plan for the rest of this iceberg is to cover it in weekly sittings, where what I'll do is I'll play some of the games off the Iceberg in a week, and then like every Sunday or so I'll release a video saying, what did I play this week? And I'll tell you about the different games that I played, like tiny indie games, even longer games if I start them. So yeah, I hope to see you in the next one.